Hi everyone, I hope you are all well. It's a great honor to give a talk at OHBM this year. And today I will talk about the research that I conducted with Kim and Jessica Andrews Hanna. How do you feel now? And what's in your mind? What comes to your mind? So our mind never rests. Thoughts and feelings come and go. And our mind usually wanders around here and there. So it's known that people spend almost 25 to 50% of their time for mind wandering, suggesting that the mind wandering is an actually important part of our life. For a deeper understanding of mind wandering or spontaneous thought, I like to use a network representation where the nodes are concepts or semantic elements which serve as building blocks of spontaneous thought. And the edges are the associations among them. Some nodes could have negative valence, while some could be positive. And some could work as a strong attractor, like the black hole, so that an individual ends up having the thought very often. And some could be too sticky to get out of the thoughts. Then we can conceptualize the mind wandering as a random walk on this network. With this in mind, we devised a new fMRI task based on a free association method named Free Association Semantic Task, FAST. It consists of two parts. The first part was the word generation task, where we provided a seed word for each run, and we had 4 runs in total, so 4 seed words, and asked participants to generate a word train of 40 associations. We gave only 2.5 seconds for each association to minimize the censoring. After participants generated 40 words in a row, we conducted a word thinking task where we showed 2 consecutive words generated by themselves and asked them to think about the personal meaning of the second word. That was the target word. And after the scan, we showed the words again and then asked multiple questions about them, including the emotional valence, how positive or negative, and how self-relevant, and relevant time period from past to the future, and how vivid, and also lastly how safe or threatening the word is to them. In sum, we developed a new task to understand the temporal dynamics of spontaneous thoughts and emotions, and also the brain representations of affective experiences induced by self-generated thought. To show what we could do with the data from this task, I'm showing one participant's example data here. We can visualize the free association trajectory on the affective dimensions. I'm showing only 3 dimensions. In this example, the participants talked about Bitcoin, suicide, fail, bubble, and so on. So time we conducted this experiment was around 2018 when the Bitcoin crash happened. And this is a network representation of one participant's data. The arrows here show the trajectory, the direction of the free association, and the color indicates the valence ratings. So this particular example shows 3 large clusters, and the first one was about family. So this participant seemed to have a brother and fought with him, and parents were in the middle, but each family member like mother, father, grandmother, all positive. So you can make a guess about the family dynamics from this data. The second cluster was about school and also objects and places, and they were mostly positive. And the third cluster showed a top node that was sadness. The node is connected to loneliness, disappointment, regret, worries, and also girlfriend. So these example data really highlight that a participant's response patterns to the task can provide rich information about the individual in terms of thought topics and affective tones related to them. And there are so many possibilities in how to analyze these data, including dynamic modeling, for example, Markov chain analysis and network modeling and predictive modeling, or combining it with natural language processing. So which are all what Jess and I are currently trying, but today, because of the time limit, I want to focus more on the fMRI data. So we particularly focused on the brain activity patterns during the word thinking period, and I want to start with showing the basic contrast map. So during thinking about the words, the default mode network regions, including medial prefrontal cortex and some subcortical limbic areas, including hippocampus and amygdala, were activated. However, unexpectedly, the visual cortex was deactivated even though the stimulus was given visually. To better understand this map, we conducted the clustering analysis based on the temporal profiles of brain activity using an FIR model. The K-means clustering analysis suggested the 4-cluster solution, and we further combined the cluster 1 and 2 that showed similar temporal patterns and also similar locations. So the first 2 clusters included VM and DMPFC, TPJ, IFG, and so on. These regions, these clusters, showed a delayed activation pattern, these 2, green and yellow. And if we do the decoding analysis using Neurosynth, a large-scale meta-analytic database, these regions were best explained by the terms like autobiographical, remembering, emotional, and memories. So we named this cluster as meaning related. The third cluster, red here, that included the somatomotor system like S1, S2, and also the insula cortex. This cluster showed a large deactivation right after the word onset and slow increase toward the end of the word thinking period. And it was best explained by the term including somatosensory, stimulation, and touch and pain. We named this cluster as sensory motor. And the fourth cluster that included the visual cortex and periaqueductal gray here. And this cluster showed a transient activation right after the word onset and then a large deactivation. So this cluster was best explained by the term including visual, sighted, navigation, and so on. So we named this cluster as stimulus driven. We then examined the regional time scale of internal state transition using this word thinking period data using the hidden Markov model implemented by Baldassano et al. So in this study, using a naturalistic movie viewing task, they showed that the early sensory regions had a fine time scale while the default mode network had the coarse time scale of event representation. And if we use our cluster solutions, we could say that clusters 3 and 4 will show a fine time scale, whereas clusters 1 and 2 will show a coarse time scale. So this is the whole brain time scale pattern of state transition based on the word thinking period data. And when we use the cluster ROI masks, our results show that the clusters 1, 2, the meaning related cluster, green color here, covered both fine and coarse timescales of state transition, providing different patterns of results from Baldassano et al. Maybe because we use the self-generated endogenous stimuli instead of exogenous stimuli. We then wanted to develop whole brain pattern-based predictive models to predict different affective dimensions using principal component regression. And the cross-validation results show that we were able to predict only the level of self-relevance and not others. And this is the predictive map for the self-relevance, and these regions are the ones that make reliable contributions to the prediction of self-relevance ratings. And consistent with the meta-analytic map for self versus other, the medial prefrontal cortex region showed positive weights along with other regions like nucleus accumbens. And for the prediction of valence rating, given that we couldn't predict the valence score directly from the trial level images, we used the divide and conquer strategy because we had a hypothesis that depending on the level of self-relevance, maybe the valence representation in the brain could be changed or warped. So we divided the data into high versus low self-relevance trials and then predicted the valence ratings, and we found that we were able to predict only the valence ratings with low self-relevance trials, not for the high self-relevance trials. And this is the valence model for low self-relevance trials, and it shows the negative to positive gradient in dorsal to ventral medial prefrontal cortex, consistent with previous literature. And we tested the valence low self model on an independent test dataset from Luke Cheng's 2015 PLOS Biology paper, in which they showed the IF's pictures to evoke negative emotions in participants. So importantly, our model worked in these two different datasets. There are training data and testing data. Does the valence low self model seem to work even in independent datasets? But why valence high self didn't work? And our reasoning was like this. The models so far were designed to work for population level prediction. So there is one model for all people. And it didn't work for high self-relevant trials, maybe because valence representations in the brain become idiosyncratic when processing highly self-relevant information. So to examine this idea, we developed individualized predictive maps of valence ratings with high and low self-relevance trials separately. And even though the model performances of these two models were comparable, the between subject variability of predictive weights was much higher for the high self-relevance trials, supporting our idea that when we process highly self-relevant stimuli, our brain representations of valence become variable across people. So in sum, we developed a new fMRI task that can provide rich information about personal thought topics and their temporal dynamics. And the brain representations and dynamics induced by the task were quite different from tasks with exogenous stimuli, and the brain representations of emotional valence became variable across people when the stimulus was highly self-relevant, suggesting the importance of using self-relevant stimuli for studying emotional brain. With that, I want to thank the funding sources and also to our Choong-Wan lab. And Byeol Kim did the most of the work, and Jess has been a great collaborator for the project. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for coming to my talk about the neurocognitive basis of ongoing thought. And I'm going to be talking about the need for us to understand what people are thinking about and when they're having those thoughts, when we're trying to understand the neurocognitive basis for ongoing thought. First, I'd like to thank some people, especially Johnny Smallwood, who supervised me while I did this work at the University of York. And I also wanted to shout out some people who are doing really interesting work that's been done since I finished these projects. It's really helped us to understand the broader implications of this work, particularly Delali, Bronte, and Narissa. Okay, I'm going to start with a quick terminology note. Mind wandering is a term many of you are going to be familiar with. It's often used in when we're talking about the sort of work that's in this symposium where we're trying to understand people's spontaneous thinking processes. And it describes the process by which people allow their thoughts to drift from the here and now to personally relevant, internally generated information or something similar to that. Spontaneous thought. The word spontaneous is often used to describe processes that are measured that are not instructed by researchers. So if you perform an autobiographical memory task, someone tells you to imagine yourself in a specific scenario. If you were to have that thought in the real world, it would be described as spontaneous thought. But it also speaks to the idea that a lot of these processes, we don't really know exactly what's happening to trigger them, and so they feel like they're occurring spontaneously. Experience sampling is just the method we use to collect self-reports about people's thoughts. It can be used to collect reports of any aspects of people's experience, but in the case of this talk, I'm going to be talking about experience sampling that specifically measures aspects of individuals' thoughts. And you can use this to measure mind wandering, which would typically be a dimension from on to off task thought, or you could use it to measure how spontaneous thoughts felt. If you ask people whether their thoughts at the moment of probing were spontaneous or deliberate. And then ongoing thought, which was in the title of this talk, is a term I use broadly to mean any thought-related information collected using experience sampling along multiple dimensions. So, just to outline the talk, I'm first going to start by saying what we know about the importance of context and content when we attempt to understand the neurocognitive basis of ongoing thought. I'm going to present some research based on this idea, and then I'm going to quickly discuss the implications of this work in terms of what it means for future studies using these similar methods. So, what do we know about content? Ongoing thought has many dimensions of content, and you can use experience sampling to measure these dimensions. A dimension might be, for example, how much you were thinking about the past, how much you were thinking images, whether you were thinking about what you were doing, the current task, or something unrelated, which would be broadly described as mind wandering. And the neurocognitive basis of ongoing thought varies by content. Here are two studies that looked at this. From Johnny and Hao Ting, and they essentially showed that depending on the content dimension of ongoing thought, the relationship between those measures and both the brain, functional connectivity, and measures of cognition in the lab changed. So, for example, connectivity in the default mode network related to future and past thought was different to that related to detailed and vague thought. So what do you know about context? Ongoing thought is also contextually bound. This means that the measures you take of ongoing thought are going to vary across contexts. And usually when we say context, we mean tasks, because most of this work is done in the lab, but also ongoing thought is going to vary depending on the environmental context in the real world. And the neurocognitive basis of ongoing thought also varies by context, and context and dimensions of content also interact. So, the clearest example of how ongoing thought is contextually bound can be seen in this study here. The dimension from on to off task thought, sometimes described as mind wandering or task focus, varies depending on how hard the task is that the person's performing. So in this study, in the easier task, people describe their thoughts as more off task. In the harder task, they were more on task, and we see that a lot. Context also affects different dimensions of content differently. So past-related thought in this study was shown to be less effective by changing the task context than future-related thought was. And Robinson and colleagues did a really nice study where they showed this across a range of different cognitive measures. The most well-replicated involves working memory capacity. In difficult tasks, the association between levels of mind wandering is negative between working memory capacity and levels of mind wandering, and in easier tasks, this is the opposite. So essentially what this means is people with higher working memory capacity do less mind wandering in harder tasks, but do more mind wandering in easier tasks. So this led us to the hypothesis that including content and context as boundary conditions could allow us to understand the neurocognitive basis of ongoing thought a bit better. And we wanted to know how reliable these results were, so we measured two different conditions. In one case, we had people perform the task I'm about to show you in 3 25-minute sessions on consecutive days, and we measured their resting state, function, and connectivity. And we associated measures of ongoing thought to connectivity measures from 4 higher-order network seeds: the default mode network, frontoparietal control network, ventral attention network, and dorsal attention network. We also had people complete the same task on 4 9-minute runs in the MRI scanner, and we measured their bold activity while they were doing it, and we related measures of ongoing thought to their bold activity in the moment. And then as a sort of broad measure of validity, we wanted to know whether these correlates that we found were consistent with the network functions in the literature. So this is the task we used. There's a simple zero-back condition. You make decisions based on the location of the shapes at the moment of response. So it's quite easy. You just say the square is currently on the right side of the screen. You only have to pay attention during the response period. You can easily let your mind wander during the non-targets. Whereas in the harder one-back, you have to continuously update working memory in case you have to answer where the shape was on the previous trial during the response period. while people perform these tasks, we took 13 questions. We asked 13 questions about the content of ongoing thought. We used a PCA to decompose this into 4 dimensions of content. We separated these across the 2 tasks. And then we looked for associations with the mean content, so task invariant, average across both tasks. And then for measures of context, we looked at task by content interactions. And like I said, we associated this with both in the moment bold activity in 60 individuals and resting state functional connectivity in 146 individuals. So we found that the dimensions of ongoing thought that came out of the PCA were roughly equivalent across studies in the lab and the scanner. The word clouds here, the size of the words is the magnitude of the loadings, and the color is the direction. So blue is negative, red is positive. So the first dimension describes broadly a sort of mind-wandering type thoughts off task. It's not deliberate. It's about the self and other people. The second dimension describes the extent to which thoughts were detailed and vivid. The third dimension separates thinking from words from thinking in images. And the fourth dimension is mostly characterized by the emotional valence of thought. So positive emotion versus negative emotion, as the emotion question asked. To what extent were your thoughts negative versus positive? These content dimensions were reliable across studies, particularly for the first 3, but not so much for the emotion component. So the factor loadings and the extent to which people engaged in these thoughts in 39 subjects who did both the in the scanner and resting state versions of the task correlated relatively highly across the 2 conditions. And context affected the dimensions in the same way across the 2 conditions. People were more off task during the easier task in both conditions. They had more detailed thoughts in the one back, thoughts more in words in the one back, and the task didn't affect the emotional valence of thoughts in either condition. So now to the neural correlates. So first I'm going to show you the relationships we found that were related to the context-dependent off-task thought dimension. So like I said before, this is interactions between this dimension of thought and context. We found that people with high connectivity between the ventral attention network and the motor cortex showed a pattern by which their thoughts were very off task while they were in the easy task and very on task while they were in the harder task. Participants with low connectivity between these regions didn't really modulate their off task thought at all in line with task demands. Similarly, in the scanner, a region in the DLPFC, which is within the ventral attention network, showed a positive correlation with off task thought in the easier task and on task thought in the harder task. On the other hand, connectivity between the dorsal attention network and this region in the just outside the visual system was related to a pattern of shifting off-task thought so that people became more off-task over time, and this was invariant to context. So this was across both tasks. Similarly, activity in the parietal cortex within the dorsal attention network was correlated similarly with on-task thought across both tasks. So again, the dorsal attention network seems to be related to on-task thought in a way that is task invariant. We also found consistent correlates of the detailed dimension of thought. People with high connectivity between the default mode network and visual cortex showed a pattern by which they maintained the level of task-dependent detail in the harder task compared to the easier task. And similarly, activity in the PCC was related to detail thought in the harder one-back, more so than in the easier zero-back. These correlates are consistent with roles in the literature. The dorsal attention network we found to be involved in transitions between on and off task thought shows relationships to goal-dependent shifts in attention. The ventral attention network we found was related to the regulation of off-task thought in line with task demands. Generally, this network is associated with a range of functions, including task set maintenance. So what we think might be happening is that this network might encode the task set, difficult or easy, and this might help people to regulate their off-task thought in line with those demands. The default mode network was related to task-related detail, specifically in a memory-guided task condition, and this is similar to results in the literature showing that this network is involved in memory-guided cognition. So, to summarize, sampling multiple contexts and content allowed us to identify reliable dimensions of thought with shared neural correlates across state and trait fMRI measures. The correlates we identified were broadly consistent with the roles of the networks in the broader literature. And it also allowed us to find association between measures of ongoing thought and neural networks that are not typically identified in studies using experience sampling, often because these studies measure experience along a single dimension in a single context. For example, most typically mind wandering during the SAR. The broader implications of this work are that the neural correlates of experience sampling measures are content and context specific. We kind of already knew this, but this is just really hammering it home that if you want to understand how experience sampling measures reflect cognition, then you need to sample across multiple contexts and content dimensions, and then try and understand how these interact. More broadly, using these content and context-specific experience sampling measures could allow us to sample cognition more broadly beyond the types of thinking that these measures are typically associated with, for example, mind wandering. This has been shown nicely in a recent study by Delali, who found that when you sample across a range of contexts, these measures of experience sampling are sensitive to those contexts. So in tasks where people had to report that their thought, they had to do a task where they said whether words on the screen referred to them or referred to a friend of theirs. And when they answered the experience sampling questions in this condition, they showed high levels of this episodic social cognition component. Suggests that these measures are sensitive to different contexts and can pick up context-specific aspects of thought. We also know that these measures show consistency across lab and real-world environments, and this means that these measures might allow us to sample cognition in the real world and get an idea of how sort of neurocognitive processes that we know to be involved in these measures from lab tasks, how these generalize to the real world, how these neurocognitive processes are being engaged as people go about their daily lives. And I just want to thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Matthias Mittner and I'm from the University of Tromsø in Norway. I would like to thank the organizers Aaron Kucyi, Julia Kam and Jonathan Smallwood for organizing this symposium and for inviting me here. Today I would like to present our latest work on modeling the dynamics of the wandering mind using hidden Markov models. In recent years, we have learned a lot about mind wandering. In particular, we have identified different types, important covariates, modulating factors, and we have also learned a lot about the underlying brain mechanisms of that ubiquitous mental phenomenon. However, we still know relatively little about the dynamics of the underlying brain states. That is, how does the brain implement switches from a fully task-focused state to a state of deep mind wandering? A few years ago, we proposed a neural model of mind wandering that postulates that changes in the intentional focus are driven by the noradrenergic system. The core idea of this model is based on the fact that it is impossible to focus completely on any task for very long. Even while we try to fully engage in a task, which we assume is characterized by optimal levels of tonic norepinephrine, our focus automatically periodically broadens to allow competing and potentially more important stimuli or thoughts to take over. In our model, this broadening of the attentional focus is implemented by temporarily increased tonic norepinephrine levels. When NE levels are high, neural gain increases, and that allows the networks in the brain to switch between different configurations. We therefore postulate the existence of a transitionary off-focus brain state that is characterized by such elevated levels of tonic NE and high neural gain. Importantly, this model predicts that the core nodes of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, should be most active during the off-focus state, while the DMN subsystems are expected to show stronger activation during mind wandering. And this prediction may actually be quite important for recent research that has shown that the role of the DMN in mind wandering may be much more complex than previously believed and not as simple as a general increase in activation in that network during mind wandering. To study the dynamics of mind wandering, we use here a fast-paced finger tapping task that we recently developed in our group. In this task, subjects are instructed to produce random sequences of taps with the left and right index fingers while strictly following the beat of an ongoing metronome. And this provides us with trial-by-trial estimates of the entropy or randomness of the sequences, and also with an estimate of the behavioral variability of the tap sequences at each trial. The idea here is that generating high entropy sequences is effortful and requires executive resources, and we can therefore use sequence entropy to assess how much effort currently is devoted to the task. In fact, what we found is that estimates of sequence entropy are correlated with performance in a classical executive function task. And we also found that entropy is reduced and variability is increased during periods of mind wandering relative to periods of on-task in our previous study. In the study that I'm reporting today, we implement this task with 27 blocks of finger tapping sequences of unequal length. And each of these blocks took about a minute and ended in a thought probe, where subjects had to indicate whether they were currently focused on the task or mind wandering. In 18 of these blocks, we asked our subjects to produce random sequences. In the other 9 blocks, subjects were instructed to simply produce alternating left-right sequences. This alternating condition was included as a control condition to allow us looking at global contrast in the fMRI. This experiment was conducted in an fMRI scanner, and we also collected pupillometric data at the same time, which we did as a marker for noradrenergic activity. Here's the standard block contrasting the alternating and the random blocks. This contrast shows that activity in the region of the frontoparietal control network, such as the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the supplementary motor area, are increased during random sequence generation relative to alternating sequence generation. And this gives us further proof that producing random sequences in this task actively recruits executive resources. In turn, the opposite contrast shows that activity in DMN regions, most importantly the PCC and the left angular gyrus, is increased during alternating blocks. The key element of the study that I want to present today is a computational implementation of our neural network, neural model of mind wandering. To implement the postulated dynamical switches between brain states, we use a hidden Markov model framework. Here we assume that each state has a distinct neurobehavioral signature that manifests in unequal distributions of the variables observed during the course of the experiment. So depending on which state we find ourselves in, our behavior will look slightly different, and this is modeled by different emission probability distributions for each of the states. But crucially, in addition to these different signatures, the probability to switch between two states is also modeled explicitly in terms of a Markov chain. The Markov property states that the probability to go from one state to the other is constant and depends only on the current state. We can therefore represent those probabilities in a transition probability matrix. As a consequence, using these assumptions, we can infer for every trial the probability to have been in each of the model states. For our data, we used a modified and semi-supervised version of the standard hidden Markov model that we called the probed hidden Markov model. In that implementation, we treat thought probes as giving us access to the attentional state during the time of the probe. So depending on the answer of the subjects to this probe, we assume that we know what the underlying state of the Markov chain was at that time. This constraint helps us identifying the solution, and it is implemented by modifying the forward algorithm of the hidden Markov model to exclude impossible state sequences that do not end in this state. In addition, we also assume that the participant always starts an experimental block in the on-task state, And that further helps to identify the model and also to map the computational states to actual neural or mental states. Finally, in accordance with the neural model of mind wandering, we also do not allow direct transitions between the on-task and the mind wandering state, but we force all transitions between these states to go through the off-focus state. The model is implemented as a fully Bayesian hierarchical model and fitted using Hamiltonian Monte Carlo techniques that are implemented in STAN. In advance of fitting our data, the model to our data, we conducted extensive parameter recovery studies, and we found excellent recovery properties and about 80 to 90% correctly classified states when we assume reasonable effect size in the simulated data. To apply the model to our data, we used our behavioral trial-by-trial data that we extracted from the finger tapping task. And that is entropy, sequence entropy, and tapping variability at every trial, together with trial-level pupillometric features, the tonic and phasic pupillary responses. The hidden Markov model was fit to these data together with the thought probes, or constrained by the thought probes, and as a consequence, we could estimate the most likely underlying state sequence for every trial. Once we determined that state, we could use this assignment to look at state-specific brain activation maps and functional connectivity. Here's a summary slide for the results of the estimation of this hidden Markov model. We see that all three states are estimated to be quite stable. The probabilities to stay in a given state are close to 0.9, but the mind-wandering state was estimated to be the most stable, while the off-focus states has slightly shorter durations. The signatures for the estimated states are consistent with the neural model. For example, tonic pupil levels here were elevated during off-focus, indicating higher NE activity in that state. Phasic pupillary responses, which are pupil contractions that are time-locked to the finger taps, were highest during on-task here, as expected. Approximate entropy and behavior variability also showed the expected pattern. That means higher entropy and lower variability in on-task relative to mind wandering, and the off-focus state being somewhere in the middle. Next, to extract state-specific activation maps, we pre-processed our data using a standard pre-processing workflow with fMRI prep and calculated the residuals using a GLM, including nuisance and task-related regressors, to estimate background resting state-like fluctuations in the fMRI during the task. We extracted activity in 17 large-scale networks using the EO70 network parcellation. To extract state-specific maps, we trained multi-class linear support vector machines to the fMRI data in order to find brain regions that distinguish optimally between these states. The result are 3 signed brain maps, one for each of the 3 states, and that plot the weights from the linear support vector machine. And these weights can be interpreted as importance for each region to correctly classify the state derived from the hidden Markov model relative to the remaining 2 states. To better interpret these results, I augmented the brain maps using bar plots that also show the same data color-coded according to the brain regions it reflects. The results of this analysis are quite intriguing, but importantly, the core regions of the deformer network, the PCC and the MPFC, showed stronger activity, specifically during the off-focus state, as predicted by the neural model. These same regions actually showed reduced activity during deep mind wandering. Intriguingly, the dorsal medial DMN subsystem, that includes the lateral temporal cortex, was increased during full mind wandering, but it was decreased during off-focus state. In addition, the ventral attention network seems to be crucial in distinguishing between the 3 states. The 2 components of this network, shown here in pink, show distinct activity patterns across the 3 states, which may be related to the way the ongoing beep stimuli were processed by the brain in these 3 different states. We also calculated functional connectivity maps by calculating correlation coefficients for pairs of nodes from the Schäfer atlas that further subdivides the 17 network parcellation. The results show that all the three states have quite distinct functional connectivity profiles. Globally, the connectivity seems to be strongest during on-task periods and reduced during off-focus. And that result is actually in contradiction with the neural model of mind wandering, which assumes that the increases in tonic norepinephrine that we assume happens during the off-focus state should cause stronger functional connectivities by means of increases in the neural gain in the underlying neural populations while in that state. In conclusion, the probe-theory Markov model seems to provide a meaningful window into the attentional dynamics and both behavioral and neural signatures of the three states postulated by the neural model of mind wandering could be extracted. The off-focus state was estimated to be least stable, while the mind wandering state was most stable. Importantly, activity of the core DMN nodes in the off-focus state followed the predictions from the neural model. However, while the functional connectivity showed clearly distinguishable patterns for the three states, they seem to be in disagreement with the predictions from the neural model. Finally, I would like to thank my colleagues and collaborators Josephine Groth, Sven Wientjes, Gabor Szewczak, and Birte Forstmann for their work on this project, and I would like to thank you for listening and for your attention. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure organizing the symposium together with Julia Kam and Jonathan Smallwood. And I'm glad to be able to share with you some of our latest fMRI work on spontaneous thought in relation to the dynamics of functional networks. I want to start this talk discussing a fundamental question about what resting state functional connectivity is and what it measures. So on the one hand, many, if not most, of neuroimaging studies in the field currently use functional connectivity, typically defined as correlated activity between brain regions, as a tool to study individual variability or a trait approach. So the assumption of this approach is that if we estimate someone's functional connectivity at time 1, barring any measurement noise, we'll get the same estimate at time 2. And that these spatial patterns might reflect stable trait-like features like personality, intelligence, or mental health status. Yet, on the other hand, there's growing interest in the field in how functional connectivity changes within individuals across multiple timescales. And this approach assumes that there's meaningful variation in functional connectivity over time. And at the cognitive or affective level, this variation might reflect ongoing changes in arousal, mood, or, of course, the topic of this symposium, spontaneous thoughts, our inner conscious experiences. And while it must be that spontaneous thoughts are reflected in brain activity during these wakeful resting states, there remains controversy over whether functional connectivity, specifically as measured with fMRI, has anything to do with this. So it's critical to resolve this issue because it has broad implications for how we interpret resting state functional connectivity studies that take the trait approach, including in the context of disease. In a 2014 paper, we took a first look at the relationship between dynamic functional connectivity and mind wandering, using a combination of online experience sampling during fMRI and questionnaires to assess individual variability in tendencies to daydream in daily life. And we found evidence that both static and dynamic connectivity were associated with daydreaming frequency across subjects, while only dynamic connectivity here, based on the variability of sliding window correlations, was associated with fluctuations in the intensity of stimulus-independent thoughts within subjects. So these relationships were limited to pre-selected regions within the default mode network using a hypothesis-driven style analysis. And at the time, we didn't look at how generalizable these relationships were within and between subjects and across healthy and clinical populations. And so today, I want to tell you about my new work where we've taken a more data-driven, multi-data set predictive modeling approach to look at generalizable relationships between whole brain functional connectivity and both state and trait measures of mind wandering. So in this approach, our first data set was used for model development. And this is a data set from a study that I previously conducted at Mass General Hospital, or MGH, that involved experience sampling during fMRI to assess fluctuations in mind wandering within both healthy adults and adults with ADHD. So we first developed an fMRI network model to predict trial by trial mind wandering within the healthy cohort, which I'm calling internal validation. We next tested whether the same model was predictive of trial-wise wandering within the ADHD cohort, and this is called external validation. We then tested the predictive utility of the model in 3 more external validations, going from a state approach to a more trait approach. So dataset 2 was a large open access dataset from the Brain Genomics Superstruct project, where 911 healthy adults underwent resting state fMRI and separately completed a questionnaire known as the Daydreaming Frequency Scale. Dataset 3 was another open access dataset from the University of Leipzig. So here, healthy adults did 4 runs of resting state fMRI, and after each run, they did a retrospective questionnaire about their spontaneous thoughts. And additionally, they completed a different trait questionnaire known as the Deliberate Mind Wandering Scale. And in dataset 4 was a resting state fMRI dataset from our collaborators at MIT, in which a new sample of patients with ADHD adults underwent resting state fMRI and completed a different questionnaire, which was simply called the Mind Wandering Questionnaire. So in dataset 1, used for model development was based on this fMRI study design that we previously published, where subjects performed the gradual onset continuous performance task shown here, or the GRAD CPT, which is this repetitive task in which subjects are asked to press a button for city scenes, which appear frequently, and to withhold a response to more infrequent scenes of the mountains. And intermittently, they're presented with these thought probe rating scales asking to what degree was your focus just on the task or on something else. So this was done in 17 healthy adults, used for internal validation of our model based on fluctuations in functional connectivity in the time window prior to the thought probes. And we confirmed that these subjects said that they were focused on something else due to stimulus-independent and task-unrelated thoughts. So, for example, rather than focusing on external distractions like MRI scanner note sounds. And this was also done in 20 subjects with ADHD, which was our first external validation. And each subject performed 36 thought probe trials. So we used a very simple predictive modeling method to model and predict mind wandering. And this is based on an adapted version of this analysis known as connectome-based predictive modeling, which is adapted here to first predict dynamics within individuals in the 17 healthy adults from our dataset 1. And I'm going to walk through that method. So first, we split the dataset into 16 subjects as training data, and we leave out 1 subject as test data. And then within the training data, we have trial by trial ratings of mind wandering or stimulus independent task unrelated thought. And from the fMRI data, we extract functional connectivity between all pairs of regions based on a predefined atlas, a whole brain atlas of 300 regions during 30-second windows prior to the ratings. And so for each trial, we have 300 by 300 divided by 2 matrix representing a functional connectome state. And then we correlate each edge or pair of regions with mind wandering ratings, and then identify all edges that are either positively or negatively correlated with the ratings. Then based on these edges, we compute the strength denoted S here, which indicates the strength to which the functional connectivity marker is expressed on each trial. And we then fit a simple linear model across all trials based on these strengths, which allows us to now make predictions in new data. So we then go to the test data and compute predicted mind wandering from fMRI and compare that with observed mind wandering. And then finally, using permutation tests, we repeat all these procedures 1,000 times, but with the ratings scrambled. So we did this iteratively, each time leaving out one of the 17 healthy subjects. And what I'm showing here on the x-axis is each individual participant when they were a test subject. And on the y, I'm showing the correlation of predicted versus observed mind wandering, as well as the mean of the null prediction shown in black, which as expected is typically close to R of 0. And what this shows is that the predicted versus observed mind wandering correlations are significantly greater than the null predictions. So at the group level, so meaning that the model-based fMRI prediction works, and we've internally validated the model. And a number of checks detailed in our paper suggest model validity and specificity. We next dug into the features or positive and negative functional connections that enabled this successful prediction. And we found that the functional neuroanatomy was really distributed throughout the brain, with 258 positive and 139 negative edges, including key nodes in the prefrontal, parietal, and temporal lobes and cerebellum. And to make more sense of this, and also as a sort of sanity check, we map these features to the functional networks that have been previously implicated in mind wandering. So what I'm showing below is the number of positive and negative features contributing to model-based predictions as a function of functional network. And interestingly, though we see contributions of various different networks, connections of the default mode network show the strongest contributions overall. And the strongest positive features between the default mode network and the frontoparietal control network. And interestingly, that matches pretty well with prior accounts, which suggests that these two networks need to cooperate to maintain an internal train of thought. And the strongest negative features between the default mode network and the sensory motor network, where these two networks become more anti-correlated during mind wandering. And this has previously been suggested as a mechanism of so-called perceptual decoupling, or tuning down the processing of inputs to primary sensory areas. And so even though our approach is largely data-driven, these major features that we get actually match pretty well with current theoretical models of mind wandering. The next critical step and real test of generalizability was to look into these external validations, both in the context of predicting states and traits. And the first validation that we did was train the model based on healthy subjects and then treat subjects with ADHD as test subjects. So these were patients who were scanned the same way using the same experience sampling method during fMRI. And this revealed a significant prediction of trial-wise mind wandering within ADHD, providing support for external validation. And interestingly, we were also able to do the reverse. So if we train the model based on ADHD subjects, we can also predict mind wandering within the healthy subjects. And importantly, though these predictions are based on trial-by-trial fluctuations and mind wandering within each group, as expected, the ADHD group reported more mind wandering on average than the healthy group. And when we look at the overall expression of the fMRI marker across all scans, the ADHD group indeed shows greater expression of that. So this first external validation suggests that our marker is generalizable between healthy and ADHD groups, and also closely tracks the increased overall mind wandering that patients with ADHD experience. We next turn to predictions of trait mind wandering from resting state fMRI in 3 independent data sets. And we found modest but significant support for generalization to these data sets. So in data set 2, daydreaming frequency scores were correlated with fMRI model predictions. In data set 3, tendencies to deliberately mind wander were correlated with predictions. And in data set 4, we split this new cohort of ADHD patients into high and low mind wandering subgroups, and found that the high subgroup expressed the marker to a greater degree, and continuous correlation kind of gave the same result. So these effect sizes are relatively weak, but what's really interesting here is the robustness of findings across diverse data sets, conditions, and populations. And the generalizability of our initial model, which was actually based on state mind wandering, to predictions of trait mind wandering, meaning that these effects might be seen because people with high trait mind wandering were actually engaging in mind wandering more intensely during resting state scans. I just want to highlight finally that our marker is probably a better marker of state rather than trait mind wandering. And we did one more test of generalizability here in data set 3 from Leipzig, where the subjects retrospectively rated their thoughts after each of the 4 resting state scans that they did. And for the rating for the item, my thoughts involve my surroundings, it declined after the first run, meaning that people's minds wandered away from their current environment over time. And what I'll plot next in blue is how the expression of our fMRI marker changed across these scans, across these 4 runs. And you can probably guess the outcome at this point. And yes, the fMRI marker increases its expression in concert with increased subjective reports of mind wandering. So in summary, what I've shown you is that a distributed functional network pattern, which was dominated by default mode frontoparietal interactions, reliably predicts trial-by-trial fluctuations in mind wandering within unseen individuals, healthy individuals and individuals with ADHD. And in 3 independent resting state fMRI datasets, we showed that expression of the same marker predicts individual trait mind wandering. We saw that in 2 datasets with healthy subjects. It distinguishes high versus low mind wandering subgroups in patients with ADHD. And additionally, it dynamically increases over time, meaning across multiple resting state scans within a single session as thought content diverges from immediate surroundings. So these findings begin to show how state and trait mind wandering may contribute to estimates of resting state networks. And this is important because with current practices of the field, ongoing experience typically isn't measured during resting state scans. So our findings suggest that there may be a need to account for this, among other factors like arousal, in the search for resting state network biomarkers. So thanks for your attention, and thanks to my co-authors on the main paper that I presented today. You can find the details in the citation shown here, and I'm really looking forward to discussions.